Okay, so good afternoon and good evening, good morning, everyone. Michelle is supposed to chair this panel. Oh yes, and she's back. So I thought there is some technical issue to begin with. But anyway, I think all good. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Millennia, and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Michelle Lim, and it is my joy and privilege to chair this keynote panel of our global dialogue. And our keynote panel today is talking directly to the theme of the conference, which is Transformative Change to Living in Harmony with Nature. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Wadamadugal clan of the Darug Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, not only of the lands that I'm standing on, but also to all the traditional custodians across this continent now known as Australia, but all the Indigenous and traditional owners of land across the different areas that are listening in from across the world. And to give my thanks to elders past and present for sustaining country through science, through custom, but importantly, through law. Today, I'd like to start by giving you a little bit of context for the discussion we're just about to have. And I'll do that very quickly because I know you really want to hear from this illustrious panel that we've have for you today. But the context being that we are in this postponed super year of biodiversity, fingers crossed, the post-2020 framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity will be concluded in October in Kunming in China. At the same time, there's ongoing negotiations under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and also, as you all know, the Conference of the Parties on the United Nations Convention, on United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change also occurs at the end of this year in Glasgow. So our speakers today will help us navigate through what should be included in these agreements, but also some of the challenges and opportunities within this. And I am delighted to introduce to you our 4 keynote speakers, the first being Dr. Anne Pollina, now has 2 PhDs, and I'll give you a bit more context on each of the speakers before they speak, but also Professor Belinda Reyes, Professor Tian Baoqing, and also His Excellency Ambassador Arif Havas El Graceno. And a little bit of housekeeping before we start, and I can see that you're all engaging in the chat already, which is wonderful. Please also use the Q&A button to include questions as we go along. We'll hear from each of our speakers for 10 minutes. I'll provide a bit more of an introduction before each of them start. And Anne and Belinda have the task of talking to what is needed, inspiring us with the sorts of thinking that is needed to achieve a world living in harmony with nature. And as I alluded to earlier, then Professor Ching and Ambassador will be talking to some of the challenges of the negotiation process. After each presentation, I'll invite one burning question from the audience if there is one. And then at the end, we'll engage in the dialogue, which this conference has been called, and invite questions from the audience. And then we'll conclude by asking each of our keynote panelists to give us a few thoughts as to what is possible for the future and how we might achieve it. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. As I said, now Dr. Anne Pollina has 2 PhDs, 2 masters, but importantly for me is Anne's capacity to engage not only with Western science and Western social science, but draw on traditional knowledge and often talks about the importance of collective wisdom and building coalitions of actors. But what is always a privilege to hear from Anne is how Anne embodies that collective wisdom in everything that she talks about. So our first keynote speaker, Dr. Anne Poelina, talking about a declaration of peace with Indigenous peoples and with nature. And Anne has very kindly provided a video for us. Would you like to, should we start with the video, Anne, or would you like to say a few words first?
Yeah, look, I think I should say some words before we show the film, because I want to provide some context. So, Nadi Gurijan Nyambu Boroyaro, Ngayo Imarawaraman, and Ngai Mandajara Nigan and Ngai Nganga Mabungurian Mujas. So, in my Nigana language, I'm just acknowledging that I'm in Broome. Broome's my home, but it's the home of Jugun and Yaru people, and I'm just paying my respect because country is a living being. It is an actor in our world all around us. So very, very important to honor that. Yeah, as Michelle said, first of all, I'm an Indigenous person, so I have a deep and enduring relationship. When I introduced myself, I said, Ngayu Imarawara, which means I am a woman who belongs to the Fitzroy River. So when you're thinking about that, it's not about property rights. It's a law of obligation to protect that river forever. And so there's big conversations at the moment around, you know, looking at rights of rivers and living water systems, but we believe that the river already is a living being. We communicate it, we sing with it, we dance with it, we cry with it, we love it. So our advocacy is for the river to live and flow in terms of looking at that work. And from that perspective, what I'm seeing is, my background is I'm biophysical, social scientist, 3 masters, 2 PhDs, but a lived experience on living on country and working collectively around the globe. So I think one of the big things that I'm hearing is this conversation of how do we create peace with nature and with Indigenous people? And when I look around the world, it is the same story that is coming from other Indigenous people around the world. What we are talking about is dealing with complexity. And so we do need collective wisdom in terms of if we are to right-size the planet, the voices of Indigenous wisdom has been muted from this process. And so what we're saying is that we are coming with a gift of, particularly in Australia, we are the oldest living culture in the world. We have lived through an ice age. We have lived and shaped the Anthropocene from the beginning of time. Our world has gone from quickly looking and caring for this guardianship role to a world where we've painted a picture that prior to settler colonialism, we lived in the Kimberley, which is on the west coast. We lived in a world of utopia. When the settlers came and the diaries depict, this was a world of utopia. There was laughter, there was singing, there was abundance of food, there was peace, there was ceremony. There was this gift of reciprocity that even when the settlers came, Indigenous people, my people, gave them a young boy to travel them along the river. So we've always come from a world of working together in collaboration. Otherwise, we could not have lived for so long on this continent in chaos and, you know, dealing with the issues. In 1816, an Italian map maker came to my country in the region, and he painted a word called, in Italian, land of peace. So we come from a world of diplomacy, of compromise, of negotiation, but we come from a world of what the world is, a lordial title, the absence of lords, that we came from a world of what we call polycentric governance. And that is why first law is so important. It is law of the land, not law of man. What has nature taught us as Indigenous people over the millennia of how we lived in coexistence? When we are born, we are given an animal, which we call a totem, to teach us that we need to have an ethics of care for our non-human family. And so what we see is that we live in a world where we're born into it, where animals can teach us how to be good and decent human beings. So these are the first law stories that teach of values, of ethics, of code of conduct, of how do we live in a civil society. We lived in polycentric governance, which means that when you have a moral contract of how we are going to live as citizens in a region, what are those rules and those codes of conduct for doing that? So Indigenous people come from polycentric governance, which means once we determine what the rules are of how we're going to live in peace and harmony and balance, then they are the rules that we commit to, and we self-regulate our behavior. So very, very important when we see the world and the world around us, that what we're saying is that unless we are factoring Indigenous wisdom into dealing with the complexity, we will not be able to right-size the planet. You know, and this is very, very important, is that we all need each other. We all need to come from multiple disciplines, multiple legal pluralistic backgrounds, multiple ways to see and be in the world. So we've got very clear ideas about how we can continue to look at this ancient wisdom and bring it into modernity, because this is where we really need to be going. So when you look at the world and you look at the IPBES and the IUCN data, what it's saying is that these remnants of biodiversity are being held on 5% of the world's Indigenous people's lands and waters. And we need to protect these places if we are going to survive. So very, very critical that we understand that Indigenous people have been the guardians of the biodiversity from the beginning of time. What the IPBES model shows us is that these last remnants are being held under the guardianship of Indigenous people, that we need to bring Indigenous people into the way we think about it. So I will add something a little bit later in regards to where I think we need to be moving, one, as nations, but two, as planetary citizens, because we all are citizens to Mother Earth, let alone to our nation states. So very, very important that we look at how do we have the just energy transition? How do we look at legal pluralism? Our laws, our public policy are failing, not just Indigenous people, but the environment and our fellow citizens. And so how do we come into cooperative governance and management of these biodiverse systems in order to build peace with Indigenous people and with nature? And right now, where I live, you can see behind me the Fitzroy River, the Muttawarra. It's a biodiversity hotspot. It has the largest global tidal delta in the world, and it is extremely amazing because of its cultural and linguistic diversity. So we have very clear ideas of what government should look like, how we can do that from a regional perspective, what the new economies should be, how we should be transitioning to a just energy transition. And part of that is that the Fitzroy River is very much on the table. There are very clear ideas about how people want to come here and trade and market water. And what we're saying is that, okay, how do we slow down? How do we really look at sustainability? How do we achieve this? And so how do we go forward? So I just want to share a little story, because the story in Australia is changing. And as sovereign people, we have to assert our sovereignty. But the story we have is that this biodiverse place is for everybody. It's for everyone, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and also for the world. So I'll just put up a little quick film of less than 2 minutes to show the story of one of our senior elders, and then I'll stop and you know, share a bit later. But for that, Michelle, if you could just play that little film, it's very, very powerful, very true in terms of now we're talking about property rights. But basically the story is that it's time to do business differently with Indigenous people. We are not anti-development. There's a whole range of economies that we can bring into how we influence this. So we're talking about how do we influence public policy? How do we influence the law? How do we create the new economies from the biodiversity and the cultural and linguistic diversity that we have? So I'll stop there and be respectful to the next speaker. But I think later on, Michelle, it would be great to be able to put that little film on the website so that people can tune in. But thank you for your time. And as I say to everybody, it's a start of a conversation. So Galia Mabu, and thank you for your time. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Anne. And my apologies. I think we really do need to see that film again. And thank you, Ningya, for pointing out that the sound wasn't working. I'm sure I can get it to work again this time. So please indulge us. We really do need to see this film. So take 2. I hope it works this time, and if it should work this time. Here we go.
We sing that story about this river. You know, my favorite story when people ask me, I only sing this song, Madhuara. It's very important to me, this river. I love it, river, you know. How can Kapman gonna try to take over the river? Kapman didn't born in this river. We born in alongside of the river. You know, we should be the one that on the river, not Kapman. It's law. We got a law too, you know, and the river got the law. This river got story, you know, big history. That Walunga stream. If river gonna go dry, that's, you know, kill the culture. We need to, you know, fight for this river, not to drain all the water out. Money is nothing, you know. But the life is river there forever.
Thank you. And my apologies again. What a beautiful phrase to end on. Money is nothing. The life is the river there forever. Thank you so much, Anne. That was beautiful. And I can see all the messages coming in from the chat. Really appreciating that video. Thank you, Anne, for sharing all of your wisdom. I will entertain a burning question if there is one, but otherwise we'll leave the questions to the end. And we'll now go to Professor Belinda Reyes, who picks up very nicely, but in a very different way on some of the themes that Anne has been talking about. But first, a little bit about Belinda. Now, I think for many people to be known, globally recognized as being one of the key writers on the planetary boundaries concept, particularly the biodiversity planetary boundary, and importantly, the difficulties of defining a planetary boundary, that would be enough for someone's life's work, but not for Belinda. She's also taken on the much more difficult role of engaging with issues of equity and justice and the interconnected nature of social ecological systems. And as you can see on the slide today, it's something that she'll be extending, talking more about to us very soon. But also Belinda has played a very important role as part of the Intergovernmental Panel Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, leading the chapter on the Aichi targets and the SDGs. And we'll hear a bit more about that as well. I'll hand it over to you, Belinda. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and for giving me this opportunity to be part of this dialogue. I'm very excited to see where we get to today. And thanks for that introduction as well. I'm greeting you all here from the early morning in the outskirts of the city of Cape Town in South Africa, where we are surviving our third very strict lockdown. And I hope everyone is finding themselves comfortable and safe wherever they are in the world. So Michelle asked me to speak a little bit about this idea of social ecological interdependencies and how we've been using it to try and challenge and blur boundaries in research and policy. Right. Let's hope the next slide comes up. Yes. So as someone who's worked in this interface between environment and human well-being or human development for quite a few decades now, I remain frustrated and challenged by the fact that these two are so often treated as separate and separable. But I am encouraged over the last year by some indications of progress and attempts to bridge the space of environment and human well-being, or environment and development. And one example is on the screens now. These are two landmark reports that came out of the UN system over the past few months. The first from their environment program and the second from their development program. But both reports fundamentally focus on the unprecedented changes, risks, and declines that we're seeing in our environmental and earth systems, in climate, in biodiversity loss, and in pollution. And they explore what that means for human well-being, for health, for inequality, and more broadly for human development. But I think particularly important is the Human Development Report that presents this notion and this figure in their report that we really are dealing with intertwined and deeply interconnected planetary and social systems or imbalances, with the potential to reinforce one another in quite dangerous and undesirable ways, but also potentially in good and positive ways if we can go about these transformative changes that many of us are trying to think about and do. And I think it's this idea of these deeply intertwined and interconnected planetary and social systems, which Melissa Leach and I, together with many other scientists from around the world, really raised this topic that we don't think it is possible or desirable to address these challenges, the sort of social challenges of inequality and the environmental challenges of sustainability at all separately. And we call for new approaches and new tools and new ways and more plural perspectives on the dimensions and interactions involved. But I think many of us note that even at the high levels of something like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the policy response remains quite bounded and maybe, you know, sort of siloed into sectors and a call for sort of a multi-sectoral response. But we still see that development or sustainable development is broken down into a bunch of social goals on the left, a bunch of economic goals in the middle, and some environmental goals on the right. Whereas we know the reality, as you can see in the bottom of that slide, is work that comes out of the IPBES assessment, where we show that changes in these environmental goals have implications for our ability to achieve all the social and ecological goals. And so separating them out is really not a very sensible way to capture these deep interconnections. But I think, you know, beneath all of this lies this very dominant perspective that still determines a lot of Western science and policy, that we're dealing with separate and separable social and ecological systems, where you have an ecosystem on one side and a social system on the other side, with sets of assets and resources, and all that connects them are flows of resources or flows of waste and management actions. And this particular perspective on the separability of environment and development, or people and nature, permeates almost every aspect of mainstream research and policy, and I think is resulting in a lot of these boundaries that many of us are trying to bridge. There are other perspectives. The one that I've been working a lot with over the last decade is still from Western science, but talks about these ideas of interdependent social ecological systems, which emphasize the embedded and interdependent nature of society and ecosystems, shaping and being shaped by one another. And what I find particularly useful about this perspective is, you know, this messy space in between, that it focuses on these social ecological interdependencies, relationships, connection, values, accountability, and feedbacks and dynamics that sit in that space, and starts to really challenge whether the two ecosystems and social systems can actually be seen as separate. Of course, there are multiple perspectives that I think are becoming more and more dominant and important in this context. And this is just some work that has come from Global South scholars, from Indigenous scholarship, and also from other African colleagues that I across the continent, really challenging this idea that when one thinks about a good society, as Professor Lele points out in his work, we think about individual well-being, we think about equity, and we think about sustainability. And in his conclusions, he really challenges this idea that environmentalism is something that is sort of anti-development or has nothing to do with human well-being, and really says that environmentalism speaks to all these dimensions of well-being, material and spiritual, individual and distributive, present and future. And I think we're seeing a lot of this work now starting to influence research, with work from my colleague, Professor Chalisa, on Indigenous research methodologies at the University of Botswana, and then also work by Dr. Nemechena on relationality. And we're seeing increasing work in the well-being space, like Professor Sarah White's work on more relational perspectives on well-being. And so we're seeing a lot of perspectives that really reject the idea that there are indeed boundaries between environment and development. And so we're seeing this starting to penetrate more than just research and discourse. In this recent Human Development Report, we do see some ideas on new ways of doing development, where they talk of expanding human freedoms in balance with the planet, and suggest that human development isn't just a problem of innovation, but that any innovation needs to be considering equity and stewardship of the environment at the same time. And I think that echoes what Anne was talking to as well, this idea of considering these dimensions of equity and environment in all aspects of what we do to the planet. This was something we investigated to see whether it was possible to address the new targets coming out of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Sustainable Development Goals post-2030, to really start saying, let's stop setting a set of ecological targets and a set of social targets, and explore whether we can set what we called social ecological targets. And we looked for evidence of these kinds of targets and found a few examples that we think could pave the way for new ways of thinking about targets in this messy relational space, where we start really challenging and blurring boundaries. And I would say we were arguing here for an approach that wasn't just cross-sectoral, but went beyond the idea of separate and separable sectors. And we conclude in this paper that we think we're sort of setting up development and environment as kind of false choices, but rather reflecting on the fact that anything that resembles a choice is actually an inaccurate snapshot, which obscures these interdependencies and defers consequences to other places and to future generations. And so really challenging the idea that we can posit environment versus development at all. I have one more point that I think I'd like to make, Michelle, if I have some remaining time. And that really, it's the point that Michelle writes a lot about in her work as well, that we're also living in a change and changing global context. In the IPBES assessment, we find, of course, that there's an increase in human population over the last 50 years, but this has been accompanied by a quadrupling in the global economy and a tenfold increase in global trade. And as Neil Adger depicts in his beautiful figure from his work on teleconnected and nested vulnerabilities, that this global trade and these market linkages and this flow of people and information and resources really reconfigures the way the world works and connects with global environmental change in surprising ways. So we see impacts landing in far distant places, often shaped by the power asymmetries and the differences and disconnect between who benefits and who loses in this world of the Anthropocene, which is itself very unequal. And it's thinking about these cross-scale social ecological interdependencies that I think presents the second challenge for policy, to not only move beyond sectors, but to really rethink the way we think about scales. And on the left there, I sort of put a kind of depiction of how we often think about policy as kind of very separable across the global, the national, and the local. But actually how we know these social ecological couplings can connect from the local to the global and back again in very fast and also very slow ways. And there's this beautiful paper that's recently come out, led by a global group of authors, looking at what happens when one country attempts to achieve sustainable development goals, and what are the teleconnected risks that that achievement might place on other parts of the world, really challenging us to think about a whole that is different to the sum of all parts. And so this is my final slide, which I end getting back to the topic of this dialogue, which is really about these ideas of transformation. And as Gina Ziervogel in her work here in the city of Cape Town has shown, it really isn't about boundaries and recognizing that they're artificial and arbitrary at best, but that we really need to find ways to connect the individual and their agency, social cohesion and collective responses with reconnection to our environment and life support systems. And it's being spoken a lot about in the policy and law space by our chair in her work looking at the global impacts and the teleconnections, but also by Frank Bierman in his work on really challenging this notion of environmental policy and its emphasis on this false dichotomy of humans and nature. And then also thinking about how we prepare for and deal with these complex interdependencies and connections. And right at the bottom there, I put this idea that I'm reminded of about 10 years ago when we were starting to debate how we move outside our boundaries of the discipline of the natural and the social sciences, and how there were calls for multidisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity, and finally transdisciplinarity, recognizing that we need more than the disciplines. We need to go beyond the disciplines. And I guess this is my challenge that I think about a lot, is what is more than and beyond sectors and scales in the policy response here? Are we talking about supranational and suprasectoral responses? And how are we thinking about agency and accountability and the power that goes along with those sectors and those scales in this work on transformative change? Thanks very much, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Belinda, and very much building on what Anne was saying. And funnily enough, it's made me think, perhaps because it's 50 years since Yoko Ono and John Lennon's Imagine came out, it's made me think of that idea of blurring not only disciplinary boundaries, but also the artificial, in many ways, boundaries of countries, of different scales as well. So imagine there's no countries, it's easy if you try. And what you, Anne and Belinda, have done so well is encouraged us, inspired us to imagine what the world could be. And yet, the challenge and opportunities we're faced with are some of the geopolitics of doing that. And our next two wonderful speakers will take us through some of the realities of doing that. So it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Qin Bao, who is a great friend of the Center for Environmental Law, not only sits on our advisory board, but also is a co-host of our global dialogue today. And Professor, as with all the other speakers, I could spend the whole of our session introducing Qin Bao's fantastic publication record, but allow me to just pick out a few key things, particularly in terms of their relevance of what we're talking about today. Not only is he the environmental law, biodiversity law scholar of China, but also was the member and vice chair of the compliance committee of the Nagoya Protocol, and also has spent time in the Chinese judiciary. So there's no better person to talk to us today about the prospects for the CBD, particularly given that China will be hosting the post-2020 framework negotiations, and Professor Qin is highly involved with that. And he'll be talking today about the evolution and challenges in China's implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Professor, please.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I'm very pleased to today to join in this panel, because this wonderful global dialogue is co-organized by three wonderful research centers from Australia, your center, from America, and from China, from our Research Institute of Environmental Law. And this is also very special for our center review, because this year is the 40th anniversary of the Research Institute of Environmental Law, which was the very first environmental law institutions in Asia, not only in China, but also in Asia Pacific areas. It was established in 1981, So at that time I was only 6, years old. So it's wonderful to look back to see how they developed of this research institute of environmental law, because in many ways it can reflect the development of the environmental law or rule of environmental law in China, including the conservation of the biological diversity in a legal way. So I like the topic as a theme of this panel very much, because it's harmony with the nature. So which is a wonderful summary or wonderful reflection of the Chinese tradition. So man should be in harmony with the nature. So according to this Chinese traditional philosophy, we can see many ways in China how to translate this philosophy into the rule of law. As a process of rule of law, is including of its implementations of the international environmental agreements. Of course, as the CBD as a main MES. So actually, according to my preliminary research result, I found that actually in many ways that China's situation is more or less similar to other transitional or emerging, or we call it new economies like India, like Brazil, like South South Africa, those countries. When we talk about the implementation of international conventions, normally we will find a kind of analytical framework. So according to the Jacobson and Reyes, the two excellent environmental law professors, they think the values and abilities are often regarded as the measure of a country's implementation. So of course that's correct. But if we examine the historical development or historical process of China's implementation or other countries' implementations of the CBD or other international environmental agreements, we can find that if we just analyze the implementation situation of one country by the way of by the standard of values and ability, perhaps it's not enough. So I was wondering if we have some new analytical framework. So I tried to provide one analytical framework, including 4 components. So one is the country's development philosophy and model. And the second is perception of the nation's environmental interests. So what kind of interests could be regarded as environmental interests or kind of national interests? Second is this the economic and technological level of this country. And the last is the kind of international attitude towards the global environmental governance. So if we use this kind of analytical framework, we could find that this framework is a little bit more, comprehensive and more dynamic and more structured. Now, if we can use this new analytical framework, we can examine the implementation process in the past 30 years, almost 30 years, since China joined China was one of the first countries to sign and ratify the CBD, and later ratified the Cartagena Protocol and the Nagoya Protocol under the CBD in 2005 and 2016. And so in many ways, China has become one of the important international forces for protecting the global and national biodiversity. So, but we can divide the implementations of China's implementation of the CBD into 3 different phases. So the first phase is we can say China is mainly as a follower of international communities. So China at that time, maybe because of its economic and technology and ideas and philosophies, it cannot provide its own ideas or concepts and or some other active contributors. So at this time, what China can do is just to follow other countries, especially the developed countries, and to comply with its international obligations under the CBD or other international biodiversity conventions. We can see a lot of this. For example, China introduced the concept of sustainable development into China, and China issued many environmental laws, but we do not have a very specific biodiversity related laws. And China's economic and technology level is not so high. That's very in 1990s. China is just beginning of this reform and opening policy. So not so big economy. And China's attitude to the international participation is more or less China hope the other countries to provide the technology, financial, and even knowledge assistance to China to how to implement the convention. But later, through the year 2000 to the year 2012, China become a more, major participant, not a passive follower of this convention. So China has its own development strategy, like the scientific outlook on development. China began to find that biosafety and genetic resources are very important national interests. And during this period, China's economic development has inherited a rapid growth, more than 10% average. And the environmental protection receive abundant financial and technical support from the central government and the local government. And China became more active in the multilateral and bilateral cooperation, and especially source-to-source cooperation. And the latest development is the phase is we can say China is more active contributors to the international biodiversity conservation and also the implementations of the CBD. So China, the main kind of a signal is that China raised the strategy as ecological civilization. So compared to the agriculture civilization and the industrial civilization, we call this civilization kind of green civilization, compared to the previous the yellow civilization or black civilization. And China realized that the biological diversity are very important environmental interests, no matter the invasive alien species or access to benefit sharing, or the genetically modified organizations or institute protection and so on. So at this time, we can find in China, we have the very first specific biodiversity law, but it's at a local level, even it's at a local level, because it's Yunnan provincial regulations on biological diversity. So that is the very first holistic local laws. Now we have the second one in Hunan province. Now perhaps in future, in whole China at the national level, we have a kind of a biodiversity, a basic biodiversity law or framework biodiversity law. Now that is very important for the implementations of the conventions. And both as this phase, China's both this total environmental investment and its proportion of the GDP has rapidly increased. And the technology for biodiversity conservation in China has been consistent, updated. And more important is the China's international perception of global environmental governance. China's participant in the multilateral cooperation become more active, and the wider range, almost all kinds of meetings of the CBD, you can find the Chinese delegation. And you can also find some of the important bilateral cooperation, like the China with the European countries, with Asia, with Australia, and even with American. And ecological and biodiversity conservation will be a priority area to other countries, especially to Northeast Asia, East and South Africa, and Central and West Africa. So you can find at the very beginning, China is kind of a target of receiving the international aid, the financial and technology. But at this time, China tried to provide the financial and technology support to other countries. Yeah. So that is the general picture of the how China is implement the international conventions, especially on the convention on biological diversity. According to my limited knowledge, I found that in other countries, for example, in India, in South Africa, or in other countries, they all have such kind of dynamic process. So its position or its perception to implementation of the International Biodiversity Convention are not kind of evolutionary because of its development of economic, technology, and international perceptions on the environmental governance, and several other factors. So, so this is important that for me to share is that for maybe for other countries, we can also use this kind of analytic framework, or we can also to in some way to examine, to assess the perception or the performance of the environmental obligation implementations of one country. So we need to more comprehensive, more historic, dynamic perspectives to have a more, wide or more accurate understanding of one country's performance. So anyway, that's I can say that right now the China's no matter at the national level and the local level and the domestically and internationally to regard as the environmental protection, including the biological diversity, as a very important component of the green development. So that's we can say is maybe in more future, in near future, we can have more fruits from this perception, from this national strategy, from this example of China. Perhaps in the near future, we can find the realization of the harmony between the human beings and the nature. So that's my very short presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Timba, and this very wonderful link to our other presentations in terms of not only what we might be able to expect as China hosts the CBD, but also in terms of what can happen at the subnational level as well, in terms of that integration that Belinda was also talking about. We've got a question in from Kath Wallace, and I'll take that now. Kath Wallace says, Professor Chin's presentation is very interesting. Too often though, China and Russia appear to block conservation measures in international marine and regional fisheries meeting. Any advice as to whether this dissonance between biodiversity and conservation versus harvesting can be influenced or changed? Oops, I think we've think we might have lost Professor Chin. Are you still there? We'll come back to that question later on, but importantly, moving, and as the question helps us move into the fisheries space. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to all of you His Excellency Ambassador Arif Havas Ogreseno, who is the current Ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to the Federal Republic of Germany. On top of that, also an alumni of Harvard Law School, and also in 2010 was the chairman of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea conference. On top of that, a former minister dealing directly with marine sovereignty. So no better person to talk to us at multiple levels of the geopolitics, of the challenges, of the opportunities in terms of how we might regulate biodiversity, but particularly in relation to how we might do that in the oceans. Ambassador.
Thank you, Michelle, for the kind introductions. And also thank you for inviting me to speak and share what I have some idea today. I would like to start with what Dr. Paulina mentioned in the beginning, that we are basically one planetary citizens, so one unity, if you will. And then also what Dr. Reyes mentioned about the importance of balance and comprehensive approach in the environment. But, Michelle, but I was in Paris 2015, member of Indonesian delegation for the final negotiation of the Paris Agreement. Indonesia, Fiji, the Philippines, number of countries, we insisted on including the word ocean in 3 paragraphs in Paris Agreement. Because logically speaking, 70% of the earth is water, is ocean. And if you add ocean and rivers and lakes, you get easily 96% of the earth is water. Like the story that Dr. Paulina showed us earlier on. But it was not successful. There was a strong rejection of including ocean in the Paris Agreement. And if you look at Paris Agreement very carefully, there is only one word ocean in Paris Agreement, and that is in the preamble or paragraph. So only after that, only after Chile, I think people start to talk about blue COP. You know, people start to incorporate oceans in the discussion of climate change, which I think is quite tragic, but it's okay. It's a bit late, but at least we are doing something about it. And this is actually a symptom, Michelle, of the mindset of us as a human being. How many movies about Mars, or the outer space? How many action movie about the outer space? How many movies about the bottom of the oceans? It's very clear, you know, even in our most imaginative realm, you know, we still don't see ocean as close, although, you know, we live there. We live in this earth. Now I want to show a drawing that I make. I hope this is clear. Okay. So this is the ocean governance architecture today. So you see all these balloons basically representing silo thinking in the ocean governance. You have IMO in London. IMO is dealing with the surface of the sea. It's navigations, the rules about the vessels. And not all vessels, only vessel above 100 gross ton. So if you are conducting illegal fishing with vessels below 100 gross ton, you are free from the IMO. Then you have the FAO, which deal with agriculture and fisheries, but only on the provision sector, on the food sectors, okay? And then you have the IOC in Paris, Oceanographic Commission, the science of the ocean. And then you have the IHO in Monaco, hydrographic organizations. I used to go to IHO very often. You see all the naval officers discussing about the maps and hydrographic charts. Sometimes they talk about a little bit of rules in the IMO, but not necessarily with the FAO. Nothing to do with the illegal fishing of the vessel below 100 gross ton. And then you have the Doha laws, the bottom, a very small body in the UN. It used to be, assistant secretary level. Now it's just a director level. And Doha laws is just servicing us, servicing member states. They're not doing more than servicing member states in terms of meetings of the oceans. And then you have the International Seabed Authority. It's talking about just the seabed and discussion about how we invest in the seabed. Office is in Jamaica. ISA has nothing to do with IMO, nothing to do with FAO. Okay, I don't think they will speak to IHO. And then you have UNEP, environmental protections, which most of the work is terrestrials. Not so sure how much work in terms of percentage on the oceans. And then you have WTO. You might be surprised. Why WTO? Because WTO has a mandate on subsidies. And fisheries subsidies is one of the most destructive policies that today is still being actually permitted. And there is not a single big country, especially the distant water fishing, that is willing to remove subsidies from the WTO rules. And then you have ITLAW, International Tribunal Law of the Sea, sitting in Hamburg. So you see all of this balloon with the silo thinking, right? And I'll show you a case of illegal fishing, for instance. So illegal fishing, if it's below 100 gross ton, it's a wooden vessel, then nobody's taking care of it. Only the country is being stolen at. But if you are stealing in the high seas, nobody really gives any attention on that. IMO doesn't look at your small vessels. FAO has no possibility of monitoring all these small vessels across the world. And if you want to bring this to WTO on the issue of subsidy, you will see a lot of problems there in terms of rejections. SDG 14 specifically mentioned by this year subsidy that is destroying biodiversity should be removed. But, it's just a dream. It's not working out, okay? It doesn't seem like government official talking about this. It sounds like an NGO. But I'm just trying to give the real situation today. And you have one document coming out of General Assembly on ocean, of course, but it's just a document in generals. You don't have actually a real discussions at the global levels on ocean governance as a unity, as a whole. So what happened is that our biodiversity at the oceans are not looked after for a very simple reason, Michelle, because we don't see them every day. People are talking about destruction of forests because you can actually see the forest, okay? You see all the video about the forest. But if you're talking about biodiversity in the Indian Ocean, 200 nautical miles from the shore, you don't see it. You don't see it, you don't care about it. And you want to bring all this factor together. So hopefully there could be some way, that this ocean governance can be tackled much more comprehensively, which is difficult. I want to take a little bit my experience with what Dr. Reyes mentioned about environmental protection, social responsibility, and development. Okay, so we have on a fishery issue, for instance. So on a fishery issue, you have to be environmentally responsible, okay, in terms of you are taking the fish out. And then secondly, you have to be socially responsible. You have to take care of the human rights of the crew and whatnot, okay. And then on the development factor is that your produce can go into markets easily. But Europe has a fleet around the world. Europe has a fleet, for instance, in the Pacific. Europe has catch tuna from the Pacific, from our neighborhood, Michelle. And when they market it to EU, then you have basically 0% tariff. But if Indonesia catch the same fish, Michelle, same species from the same neighborhood in Pacific or Australia, and you send it to EU, you get 20% tariff. So balance and the issue of environment, it's sometimes is a discussion that is very interesting, it's very nice, but when it comes to subsidy, which is a local domestic politics in many different regions in the world, then all those things goes something like this. Yeah, environmental protection for you, not for me. For your forest, for your sea, for your people. You don't sell anything that is environmentally bad to me, but then if we are doing it ourselves because we have subsidies, politically sensitive, something to do with the votes, then I'm sorry, we have to do this. And if we want to fight at the WTO to remove the subsidy for fishery, for instance, or we want to go to WTO to remove subsidy on agriculture, for instance, then you have a totally different story. So one of the big issues that the CBD is going to discuss coming up in Kunming is about agriculture, pollution from agriculture. But pollution from agriculture is directly linked to subsidy. In EU, is 60% of the EU budget is for agriculture subsidy. It's massive. It's 80 billion euros plus. Okay, you want to remove that? I don't think so. So that is a reality. Everywhere in the world, you see still discrepancies, and at the global level on the ocean, even you see, if you look very carefully, then you see all this drawing where we live in one planetary citizenships, we live in one planet, but even the management of the oceans is separated, very unfortunately. So what I hope, and I've been saying in many different conferences, I think there must be some form of a platform, at the UN level to discuss different aspects in much more deeper and serious manner, okay? And then you will start to see, ocean governance coming up in a better situation. So we hope to have even bluer COP in Glasgow, and we also hope to have a blue CBD in Kunming. But let's see how the world take on these challenges, because this is an aspect that goes deep into local politics of many different countries in the world. So it's not very easy. So once again, thank you very much. I hope this is useful just for picking up the ideas in the discussion. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. And in many ways, what you've demonstrated so well is the contrast between what we're hearing Anne and Belinda talk about the need for these interconnections to be taken into account, and literally illustrated how far the legal system has to go, even just in the oceans, but linking to other systems as well. So thank you so very much to our wonderful panelists. I can see some questions already coming in the Q&A box. Please do keep them coming, but unfortunately, Anne has had an emergency and won't be able to join us, but a question I will pose to all of our speakers as and then pick up on individual questions in the Q&A. A question to all of our speakers is, what have we learnt in the existing processes so far? What have we learnt? What lessons can we take forward? And I think I'll start with Belinda.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, it's been wonderful to hear all these different perspectives. And I think the one thing that comes clear to me in listening across all of these and in the experiences we had during IPBES is that these ideas of boundaries, you know, recognizing that they're artificial and arbitrary and things we've invented, boundaries don't really exist in the real world between people and nature, between countries, or even between ecosystems. But what we learned is that boundaries aren't only frustrating, they can actually be very problematic and quite dangerous. And they result in a sort of hierarchy or prioritization where we see, for example, anything that's seen as an economic target gets prioritized, say in the space of the Sustainable Development Goals, and anything that's a social target follows on behind the economic targets, and very low down on the prioritization are the environmental targets. And we saw this come true in 2019, where despite the high-level messages coming out of IPBES talking about these unprecedented declines and the existential risks posed by the extinction rates and the high levels of degradation we're seeing around the world, in the high-level report coming out of the SDGs and the Secretary General's report, the word environment and ecosystem are only mentioned once in the final section on cross-cutting priorities and actions needed moving forward. And one sees a much stronger prioritization of these other sectors. And I think in ways we see that too happening as we start to pretend as if national borders are actually true. We see these things called sustainability blind spots, I think was the word that I've seen them labeled with, where one country achieving several SDGs can actually undermine another country's ability to achieve those SDGs. And so I think we learned sort of the hard way that these boundaries are deeply problematic. And we were strong in our recommendations in terms of suggesting that CBD and SDG really start to challenge these ideas that boundaries actually exist between sectors and between scales, and think about that in terms of accountability and reporting. I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to come back in more detail.
Thanks, Belinda. And Tianbao, what are some of the lessons going forward, particularly in terms of what we might expect?
Sorry, I cannot hear you again.
Some of the lessons that we've learned, what are the key lessons that we've learned, and what might we expect going forward in terms of the CBD processing in Kunming?
You mean the whole process, the globally or the within China?
In particular, as to how the global process might evolve given China's leadership in hosting the post-2020 framework negotiations.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so for me, I think it's, China's position is very unique. So, you know, China is always regarded as one of the developing countries. Economically, legally, it's a developing country. But because it's vast economic power, and it's land areas, and it's more important technology strength. So China can play a more important role than most of the developing countries. So as a host, China is like a bridge between the developing countries and the developed countries. So I think it's very important that China can understand what are the developing countries' interests in conserving the biodiversity, because itself is a developing country. Yeah. And on the other hand, the developed countries may have some different interests or requirements from the developing countries. So as a middle, in the middle stage, and China as a bridging country can coordinate the two different the world. I think that is the most important point for China to play its role in hosting successfully of this COP15, and also to promote the post-2020 biodiversity framework.
Thanks, Tianbao. And Ambassador, given the huge challenges that you've articulated, including about the difficulty of having the oceans recognized within the climate space, what sort of lessons?
Yeah, what we learned so far is, I think, that we are not yet in coherent mode when we're talking about a global biodiversity. For many different reasons, based on my observation when I was in Paris in 2015, it comes naturally because I would say most of the negotiators, they are not aware of the oceans. They are those who normally come from the Ministry of Forestry, the Ministry of Environment. Discussion is about forest fire. So very terrestrial minded. So naturally, to bring a global view, oceanic point of view is different. Okay, even in a country like Indonesia, where we have people living in the ocean, in the coastal area, they are oceanic, but there are many people who live in the mountain. They don't necessarily associate themselves being an oceanic nation. So I think this is the challenge, the mindset. It's good that we have seen changes in this particular mindset. It's good that we have a lot of initiative trying to bring in oceans, although it's not in a legal such a way, because legally that you mean you have to change the Paris Agreement, but at least we can use some general languages in Paris Agreement to bring in oceans. The NDI, for instance, has already started bringing ocean in the last 2 years, which is actually very good. Now, what I'm afraid of, Michelle, is COVID, the pandemic. It's not so much that the COVID itself influence biodiversity or influence ocean. No, it's again the mindset. You see patriotism, closing the borders. This is a mindset that we want our citizen first. This, I think, comes out from a previous administration in the US. Our country first, our people first, and then you close the border. Okay, this is a new paradox where these countries are disengaging for international legal systems. The US left WHO when they should have been there. Now it's returned, but there is no guarantee that this will not come again in the future. So the mindset of, there's a very nice piece, I forgot which one, I think last year, is a paradox of paradigm and international law. Basically says there is a patriotism paradox, there is a border paradox, and there is inequality paradox. So if you look at the number of people being vaccinated today, for instance, only 1% coming from developing countries. You're looking at the border paradox, we'll try to close the border. And if you're talking about patriotism, then my country first. So if we are looking at this mindset continues to go on, then those silos on global ocean architecture will continue to remain the same. So hopefully in Kunming, we can gauge, we can feel, what are the leaders are saying and talking. And then hopefully we can move from there. Keep our finger crossed. Let's see what happens.
Indeed, fingers crossed indeed. Thank you, Ambassador. We've got 10 minutes left and I'll try to get through as many questions in the Q&A as possible, starting with one from to Belinda from Vera Harig. I hope I've got that correct. Thank you very much for your presentation and getting back to that point for the need for cross, multi and interdisciplinary approaches. The question being policy development processes, as articulated in Ambassador's talk, often take time, do not have the same temporal cycles compared to research. How can governments adjust and respond faster to new information coming from new research?
Well, if only I knew the answer to that question. But I think, we do know a lot of things now about policy change, and especially transformative policy change, that it's multi-level and multi-phase. And there was a great review that looked at South Africa's water policy and Chile and Uzbekistan's natural resources policy, and how big socio-political change actually allowed those policies to grow and become more established in the ways we all desire in terms of transformative change. But I think the risk is there's an opportunity for new policy, but the phase of stabilizing that policy is the one we're really struggling with now in South Africa, where we have enshrined human and environmental rights in our water policy, and we're struggling to implement those. And sort of these big forces that pull one back into former policy domains are always around. So I just think it's important to recognize that that change that you're hoping for is seldom going to be linear and requires both experimentation, opportunity, and stabilization at multiple levels. Thanks.
Thanks, Belinda.
I can put that reference in the chat box as well if anyone's interested.
Great. Moving, I'll try to, there's a series of questions. Tianbao, your presentation has generated a series of questions, and I'll try and roll them in together. The first from the first from Kath from earlier, and the other from YHR. And Kath's question very much talking to that need to link with what Ambassador was talking about in terms of regional fisheries approaches, and balancing conservation and harvesting in the ocean space. And the question from YHR is about whether China will consider revising biodiversity protection laws in the future. And there's others from Vera, excellent questions from Vera, but I think we might leave those in the interest of time. So the first question in terms of the fisheries link, and the second question about domestic biodiversity protection laws.
Yes, thank you. The fisheries have two different natures. One is economic nature. Another is ecological nature. So as to fishery, so the law is try to balance the economic interests and ecological interests. In China, according to the new Yangtze River protection law, so along this the river, we have a 10 years ban, totally ban on the fisheries along this Yangtze River. So that is a very important the measure in the whole China to try to protect the river ecosystem, to conserve the fishery resources and to try to achieve this, we call this the harmony with the nature, because this the fishery is always important for many the fishermen and also for some local governments. But China has made a great and ambitious decisions to ban for the 10 years, the coming 10 years, the fisheries in Yangtze River. So also in other important ecological river zones. Yeah. On the other hand, fishery is also part of biological diversity. It's, in near future, according to my understanding, it is possible for the central government to consider the possibility to enact a new, maybe it's a systematic or umbrella law on biological diversity. Yeah, this is many scholars has urged the possibility, but it's not on the legislative plan, but it's possible in near future. Since we have already two local examples. So at Yunnan province, you know, Yunnan is the host of this COP15. Yeah, it's the very first provincial level regulations on biological diversity. Second is the in Hunan is another very biological diversity rich county. They have a city level biological diversity legislation. Yeah, so it's we have these two. Perhaps we have more in future at the local level. And according to Chinese model, so if it is not easy or it's not possible to enact a national law, we allow the local, because the local government, the local parliament has their legislative power, so they can do some experimental legislation. If this legislation are all successful or mainly successful, we can upgrade these laws into the national level. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And that links very well with exactly Belinda's point about the in practice, how that is already occurring in terms of experiential approaches to regulation. I can see a range of other comments coming in and also other questions which unfortunately we won't get to, but I would like to end by asking each of our speakers to talk us through what you see as possible futures and ways to get to a world where we are living a bit more in harmony with nature. Belinda and Tianbao and Ambassador, you will have the last word.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'm really sad that Anne had to leave, because I would have really liked to hear what she had to answer for this question. But I think in listening to her presentation and thinking about this, I would be excited about a future that sees us mobilizing these more diverse perspectives on humans and nature, and challenging some of the dominant modes of thinking about environment and development, or people and nature, as separate and separable. And IPBES has done a wonderful job of mobilizing these more plural perspectives on a more deep interconnection and relationship. And it would be really exciting if we saw some of that actually starting to move more into the policy negotiations and spaces that we see emerging in the next few months with the COPs and other processes. So that's my wish for a future. I think that's not only to stop having one perspective, but actually embrace multiple perspectives on these relationships. Thanks.
Thanks, Belinda. Tianbao.
Yeah, so I totally agree with the message from Belinda, and actually I also very welcome the points from our first presentation. So in China and also in many other, with long history countries, they have plenty of traditional knowledges. Majority of these traditional knowledges are actually very environmental friendly and natural friendly. So if our lawyer can learn something from these traditional knowledges, we can find this maybe some kind of great legal philosophies combine the traditional knowledge with the model legal measures, we can achieve our goal as kind of a harmony with the between the nature and the human being. Yeah.
Thanks, Tianbao. And Ambassador, the final word to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I think this maze or a web of interconnectedness, although it's a silo, but it's connected. I think the key issue is try to find the pressure points in one particular spot, in one particular place or organizations that can impact the different aspect. Okay, so I'll give you a very simple, numbers. In 1990, the number of the fish that can be sustainably harvested was 90%. This was a number in 1990. The number in 2017 has become 65%. And in the next 10 years, probably even less. So this is directly connected to many research that I've seen with the subsidy in WTO. So if you stop the subsidy, if WTO simply says that no more subsidies for distant water fishing, then it will stop or reduce dramatically. And this will impact a sustainability issue in global biodiversity. This will impact the issue of pollution, for instance, coming from the fish vessels, which then help the IMO. It will help a lot in terms of managing resources sustainably in the FAO. So it has a different impact in different spots, but you have to find where is the spot where you can influence mostly. Because otherwise we will just be walking in a sleep, and then suddenly, all the resources in the oceans are already gone. So thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And in many ways, echoing some of the key messages of the IPBES global assessment about identifying where the levers and leverage points might be. Thank you to all our wonderful speakers. I know everyone's applauding even though you can't see them and hear them. This has been an excellent session addressing really important issues of our times. And if you will indulge me, I'd like to leave with, we've asked our speakers to end by imagining what might be possible. Well, someone else has done some imagining as well.
You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
To a world living in harmony with nature and with each other. Thank you everyone for this wonderful, wonderful session. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Nege, everybody.